Welcome to 21st Sports, and today we're going to be talking about the Philadelphia Eagles and their hiring of Doug Pederson as their new head coach. So Doug Pederson taking over in Philadelphia, and he was the offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs in 2015, 2014, and 2013. So he was the Chiefs' offensive coordinator for the last 3 years. And then the 2 years prior to that, in 2011, 2012, he was the quarterbacks coach for the Philadelphia Eagles. And he was also on the staff in 2009, 2010 as offensive quality control. So he was with the Eagles for 4 years on their coaching staff from 2009 to 2012 before going to Kansas City with Andy Reid as the offensive coordinator for 2013 to 2015. And while he's been in Kansas City, he's had some success in certain categories. Other categories, not so much. But the thing he has done with the Chiefs is had a lot of success with their ground game. Of course, Pederson used to be a quarterback in the NFL, and he actually played with the Eagles for 1 year, where he actually won 2 games. Of course, he lost 7, but he was primarily a backup quarterback in the NFL during his playing days. But he has had a lot of success with the ground game in Kansas City. Also, he's had success in the turnover department in terms of limiting interceptions, as all 3 years that he was the offensive coordinator with the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chiefs were number 1 in terms of the least interceptions that they threw. So he did a really good job of coaching Alex Smith and getting him to take care of the ball there in Kansas City. Of course, Alex Smith is not known to be the best of quarterbacks or the most proficient passer, but Pederson did a good job with Smith in terms of keeping the turnovers limited, and they were the number 1 team all 3 years in terms of having the least interceptions. So they might not have put up a lot of yards or touchdowns through the air, but they did have a lot of success on the ground all 3 years. In 2013, the Chiefs had the 5th most rushing touchdowns, the 3rd most rushing touchdowns in 2014, and they had the most rushing touchdowns of any team this past season in 2015. So they had a lot of success on the ground. And of course, the Eagles have who was the number 1 rusher last year, and that being 2014, DeMarco Murray. Of course, he had kind of a slump year this year. Didn't get a lot of touches, not a lot of production out of DeMarco Murray. All the money that they spent in free agency bringing him over from Dallas, they want to get some production out of him. And with Pederson as their head coach, they should be able to do just that. So that's a big reason, I think, why they brought Pederson in, was for that right there. As you see his numbers as offensive coordinator in terms of yards, I just went over the touchdown numbers, but they were 10th in yards in 2013 and 14, and they were 6th in rushing yards this past season in 2015. So a lot of production out of that ground game in Kansas City. And in terms of points overall on the offensive side, they were 6th in 2013, 16th in 2014, and 2015 they were 9th. And then when you look at the giveaways, takeaways, they were in the top 5 all 3 years that he was at the helm. Number 2 in the league in 13 and 15, and number 4 back in 14. So they had a lot of success in terms of their ground game in Kansas City, and they did a really good job of protecting the ball, especially through the air, with Pederson as their coordinator. And that's what they're hoping to get out of him there in Philadelphia, is if they can limit those turnovers and if they can play more to their strength of their ground game, the Eagles with Pederson could have success. So I think it's actually a pretty good hiring of Doug Pederson. It also brings back, some of that Andy Reid winning mentality and culture that he had there for all those years. Of course, they were never able to get the big prize, but we've seen before where assistants under certain coaches that were prominent in the league have gone on to even surpass their mentors. So it'll be interesting to see if Pederson can have more success in Philadelphia than Reid did. Reid established himself over a long time and even went to 4 straight NFC Championships games over a certain stretch there, and even making it to the Super Bowl once, although not getting that trophy. And Pederson's going to be looking to try to do what no other coach has done in Philadelphia, and that's win the whole thing. So it'll be interesting to see. They've got a lot of talent, and if they can put more of an emphasis on that running game there in Philadelphia with Pederson as the coach, you get a lot of production out of it. It should also bolster their defense because it'll keep them off the field. Whereas under Chip Kelly in 2015, the Eagles were a team that was on the field consistently. They were on the field almost twice as much on defense as they were on offense. If we actually look at some of the numbers comparatively between these two teams over this last season, in terms of yards per game, the Eagles were 12th in the league in yards per game, as they had 364 yards on average per game. The Chiefs were actually 27th in the league with total yards on offense per game with 331. So, and a lot of that had to do with the passing yards. We look at points per game, and the points per game, the Chiefs were 9th in the NFL, averaging 25.3 points per game, and the Eagles were 13th, averaging 23.6. So that's 1.7 more points per game that the Chiefs averaged per game, almost 2 points there per game on average. Then we look at the rushing stats, and on the ground, actually no, let's look at the turnovers first, and then we'll look at the rushing stats. In terms of turnovers, and that's been a real strength for Kansas City, especially with Pederson as their coordinator, the Chiefs in 2014 were plus 14 in their turnovers. So they did not have a lot of turnovers. They were number 2 overall in terms of turnovers. And the Eagles were actually a minus 5. They were 24th. So that's a department in which the Eagles struggled in 2015. They were able to force turnovers a lot back in 2014, but in 2015, they weren't able to get the turnovers on defense, and they were turning the ball over on offense, whereas you saw with Kansas City, they were forcing turnovers, and they were protecting the ball. As I already said earlier a couple times, in terms of interceptions, they had the least amount of interceptions during the tenure in Kansas City with Pederson as their offensive coordinator for the last 3 years. They were number 1 in terms of the least interceptions, and they were number 2 in 2015 in terms of turnover differential. So that's a big factor right there for his hiring in Philadelphia. We look at the rushing, or actually let's look at the passing stats first, then we'll look at the rushing stats. I keep saying the rushing stats, but the passing stats, not a lot of yards per game for the Chiefs, and that's something that'll be interesting to see what they do with that and who they end up having as their quarterback coach. And he does have the experience of quarterback. Of course, a lot of that has to do with Alex Smith is not really, a big-time passer. He's really good at managing a game, and he also is really good at running the ball for a quarterback and running the option. But that right there shows you kind of the job that Pederson had to do in terms of managing the talent that he had around him. It'll be interesting to see what they do at the quarterback position in Philadelphia now. Of course, we'll see if they stick with Bradford or what they end up doing. You never know in Philadelphia, but the Chiefs last year, in terms of yards per game through the air, only 203.4 yards per game. They were 30th in the NFL in passing yards. The Eagles were 12th, as they averaged 255.4 yards per game on average. So 52 more passing yards per game for the Eagles this last year. But on the ground, that's where Kansas City really came up big time. On the ground, the Kansas City Chiefs averaged 127.8 yards per game. They were 6th in the league in terms of rushing yards per game. The Eagles, Despite all the talent they had in that backfield, they were 14th, and they averaged just 108.9 yards per game. So almost 20 more yards per game for the Chiefs on the ground, despite losing Jamal Charles, one of the more talented backs in the league, as they got big seasons out of Chikandrick West and Spencer Ware. And if he can get that kind of production out of those backs, then the Eagles should have one of the top rushing games in 2016. So be interesting to see what he does also on defense. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you think this was a good hiring, or do you think maybe they should have went a different route? Definitely interested to read your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very much for listening. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good week and have a good weekend and enjoy all the sports.